Okay, we're currently looking at Daniel chapter 8, where I told Meg this morning, I said I was finishing up reviewing here. I said we're in chapter 8, and however far we get in chapter 9, I said it's heavy sledding. You see, so we're in the midst of it here. Daniel chapter 8, which involves a vision that was given to Daniel a couple of years after the vision of chapter 7. So the vision in chapter 8 is either 551, 550, or 548, 547, depending on when you put the first year of Belshazzar's co-reign with his father Nabonidus. And it's either way, we're about 10 years before the fall of Babylonia to the Medes and Persians. And Daniel first sees a ram with two large horns that becomes great, overpowering all opposition. And then the angel Gabriel lets us know that this ram represents the Medo-Persian Empire. And then Daniel sees a male goat with a large horn between its eyes that races across the earth from west to east. And it overpowers the ram. It overpowers the Medo-Persian Empire. But while the goat is in its prime, while he was still strong, its great horn is broken off, and four large horns arise in its place. And Gabriel tells us in chapter 8, verse 21 to 22, that this represents the kingdom of Greece, and the great horn represents its first king, which is, of course, Alexander the Great. And the four horns that arise in the place of the great king, they represent four kingdoms that arise out of the first king's empire. So they are subdivisions of the Grecian Empire, this great kingdom that Alexander creates. And this is fulfilled, as I say, 200 years later, roughly, a little over 200 years later, what he's seeing is fulfilled. So after Alexander the Great's death, at a young age in 323 BC. Okay, so Daniel's roughly 550. He's being given a vision that's going to happen down here in the 4th century. And Alexander the Great conquers this territory. He dies at a young age in 323 BC. And his kingdom was then divided among four of his generals. And the two, as I said last week, the two that are of most interest to us are Ptolemy in Egypt, and you have Seleucus, who has Mesopotamia and Syria. And those two kingdoms, if you will, those two divisions of the Persian Empire, they wind up vying for control of Palestine. And Daniel's vision, in the vision, a horn that began small arises out of one of the four horns, meaning this is a ruler. This horn is a ruler. It's a ruler that comes from one of the four kingdoms that resulted from the breakup of the Grecian Empire after Alexander's death. And in discussing this vision, I'm going to use Andrew Steinmann's translation of verses 9 to 12. And I do that a lot of times because it just makes it easier for me in explaining how I understand something, that I don't have to go back into all of these other issues. You can see here's an Old Testament scholar, a Hebrew scholar, and here's his translation. That fits more with how I'm understanding it, so it just makes it easier for me to do that. I'll do it with another set of texts here in a minute. But you see here in Steinmann's translation, he sits here and says, single horn began small, but it became very large toward, aggressive toward, big toward. And he says, the beautiful land, and the beautiful or the glorious land, as Steinmann renders it, well, that's a reference to Israel. And you can see the similar language about Israel used in Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 6, Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 15. And then the traditional translation of host of heavens is rendered by Steinmann. It's also rendered that way in the New English translation, the New Jerusalem Bible follows with a plural, army. So instead of hosts of heaven, Steinmann says army of heaven, as does the New English translation, New Jerusalem, armies of heaven. And these armies of heaven is a way of referring to that. Now, so we have army of heaven, and if Steinmann is correct that heaven is a circumlocution, simply meaning a roundabout way of referring to God, as it was quite clearly in chapter 4, verse 26, where heaven there clearly refers to God. So if Steinmann is right in seeing in the phrase army of heaven, that heaven being a circumlocution for a roundabout way of referring to God, well, then what you have there is the army of God. And that is probably a reference to Israel, known elsewhere as the Lord's army or the Lord's host. You see that terminology in Exodus chapter 7, verse 4, and Exodus chapter 12, verse 41. Now this king that comes out of you have the Grecian Empire, it then breaks up into 4 empires, and this king that we're talking about comes out of one of those aftermath of the Grecian Empire, one of those groups. He comes out of that. And this king tramples the people of Israel. And he magnifies himself against the prince of the army. Okay, probably referring to God himself, preventing the sacrifices that are made to the prince of the army, the sacrifices that are made to God, and attacking his sanctuary, attacking his temple. So interrupting the sacrifices and attacking his temple. And Gabriel explains in verses 22 to 23 that this horn represents a bold king, an arrogant king that's from one of the 4 kingdoms. That's where he comes from. He arises out of one of those kingdoms in the aftermath of the great king's empire. And he adds in verses 24 and 25 that this king will be powerful and crafty, and he will bring destruction on the people of God. He will have an exalted view of himself, and he will even rise up against God. He will rise up against the prince of princes. But he will be defeated by God. When it sits here, it says, he will even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. No human hand is a reference to God doing something. So he's going to be defeated by God. Now, this is widely recognized, okay? I'm not the least bit odd on this. This is widely recognized as a prophecy of Antiochus IV, who in 175 BC, okay, keep where we are. Daniel's prophesying this. He's in about 550 BC, but he's looking way down the road. God is revealing something to him. And in 175 BC, this fellow Antiochus IV, he usurped the Seleucid throne. You remember one of the generals, the first was Seleucus I? Well, that empire there, well, Antiochus IV, in 175 BC, he usurps the throne at the death of his brother Seleucus IV, and then Antiochus takes this surname of Epiphanes or Epiphanes, okay, which means in Greek divine manifestation. Okay, so Antiochus IV takes that surname meaning divine manifestation. That's a clue to you. Okay, about something about the person's attitude, and that he's off spiritually. Now, as most commentators agree, okay, so this isn't odd either. Most commentators agree, the statements that you have in chapter 8, verse 17, and in chapter 8, verse 19, that the vision is for the time of the end. Okay, that means that its emphasis or focus is on the time period addressed at the end of the vision. The 2,300 evenings and mornings of oppression by the horn that precede the restoration of the temple in chapter 8, verse 14. This is confirmed by the fact Daniel's vision, his vision is called the vision of the mornings and evenings in verse 26. In other words, in this context, the vision is for the time of the end, not in the sense that it refers to the absolute end that will occur at the return of Christ, but in the sense that it refers mainly to what occurs at the end of the vision. That's the focal point of the vision, is what's going to happen at the end of the vision, not the end of history. C.F. Kyle, who was a very well-known scholar of a prior generation, Old Testament scholar, he says, time of the end is the general prophetic expression for the time which, as the period of fulfillment, lies at the end of the existing prophetic horizon. In the present case, the time of Antiochus. Okay, so I wanted to address that, because when you see time of the end, you might be thinking end time. I don't think that's right. I think he's saying the focus of the vision is on the end of the vision, what's happening at the end of the vision. And you notice that this horn that we're talking about, this horn is associated with the third kingdom. Right? This horn comes out of Alexander's empire, the Grecian empire that breaks up into four, and he's associated with the Grecian kingdom, whereas the little horn that we talked about in chapter 7, that little horn was associated with the fourth and final kingdom, with the Roman Empire, which I suggested functions as a type, that the Roman Empire as a type represents all subsequent kingdoms. So that's not true. Here, this one comes out in association with the Grecian Empire, and there are a number of other differences in the statements about the little horn in chapter 7 and this horn that we're talking about in chapter 8 that support distinguishing them. They are not the same. Okay, they're not the same. Including, one of those statements is including that the dominion that is taken from the little horn in chapter 7 is said in chapter 7, verse 27, to be given to the saints of the Most High. That's a difference. There are other differences. So don't get confused and think simply because rulers are represented by horns that when we have a horn, they're the same. They're not. This is a reference to Antiochus, who rises out of the Grecian Empire. Now, from 198, okay, remember, so Alexander dies in 323. You have the breakup of the kingdom. You've got the Seleucids and the Ptolemies vying for control of Palestine. Well, from 198, so for over a century, the Ptolemies control Palestine. But from 198 to 165 or 164 BC, Palestine was under Seleucid control. And in 175 BC, this character I'm telling you about, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, he begins to rule in the Seleucid or Seleucid Empire. And they're controlling now at this time, they control Palestine. And in response to bribes paid to Antiochus IV, he appoints as high priests in Palestine, high priests of the Jewish faith, men who were favorable to the Hellenization of Palestine. In other words, men who were into the Greekification of Palestine, having the Jewish people get more in tune with the Greek culture. So he had been paid bribes, and in return for those bribes, he appoints as high priests men who are all about the Hellenization of Palestine. And in 169 BC, while he was being escorted by one of his appointments as high priest, the second of his appointments, he appoints a man named Menelaus. And while he's being escorted by Menelaus, he plundered the temple. Antiochus IV plundered the temple. In the words of the Jewish writing, first Maccabees, he took the golden altar, the lampstand, the table for the bread of the presence, the cups for drink offerings, the bowls, the golden censers, and curtain. So he's basically plundering the temple while being escorted by the person he has appointed as high priest for a bribe. And he just, so now he calls himself the divine manifestation. He's plundering the temple. That's in 169. And then he goes down to Egypt in 168, really feeling his oats. And he wants to conquer Egypt. And the Romans tell him, ixnay, baby. Okay? You're not doing this. And so they wind up thwarting his designs on Egypt, and they forced him to withdraw in humiliation. And he was not happy about that. So he comes back up from his thwarted attempt to conquer Egypt, and when he comes back up into Palestine, he took harsh vengeance against Jerusalem for an attempt that had been made to unseat Menelaus, the person he had appointed as high priest. So he comes back, Antiochus IV comes back, 168. The Romans tell him, you're not having anything to do with Egypt. Go back, tail between your legs. He's humiliated. He's chapped. And here he comes back and finds out that these Jews have tried to unseat Menelaus. And according to 1 Maccabees, chapter 1, verses 29 to 33, which First Maccabees is a Jewish work which dates to the late 2nd century BC. So let's think 120 BC maybe. Okay? That's when this writing is. And according to that writing, it says 2 years later, referring to 2 years after the time that Antiochus plundered the temple. He says, the king sent a chief revenue agent to the cities of Judah, and he came to Jerusalem with a heavily armed host. And he spoke peaceful words to them with deceit. And they trusted him. But he fell upon the city suddenly and struck it a great blow. And he destroyed many people from Israel. And he took the spoils of the city and burned it with fire and tore down its houses and the walls around it. And they took the women and children captive and took possession of the livestock. And they reconstructed the city of David with a large and fortified wall with fortified towers. And it became a citadel for them. Now you're thinking about the horn in Daniel's vision. How he tramples on the people of God. And all that he does. And Everett Ferguson says in his book on backgrounds of early Christianity, speaking of this Antiochus and this event that happened in Jerusalem, he says, the walls of Jerusalem were broken down. A new citadel, the Acra, was erected to dominate the temple area, and a garrison was stationed there, converting the city into a military settlement. Menelaus and the Jewish Hellenizers, these people who are all about turning Jewish people into Greek culture, collaborated with the military settlers in modifying the temple service into the worship of the Semitic Lord of Heaven, Baal Shemayim, who was identified with Zeus. This is happening in the temple. He goes on, he says, according to Jewish sources, Antiochus IV in 168 or 167 BC issued decrees prohibiting the practice of the Jewish religion. Well, this ruler is very much an enemy of the Jewish faith. He says the scriptures were to be destroyed, the Sabbath and the festivals were no longer to be observed, the food laws were to be abolished, and the circumcision was no longer to be practiced. 1 Maccabees 1, 41 to 64. Moreover, at the end of 168, 167, a smaller altar was erected on the top of the great altar of burnt offering, and as the supreme insult to Judaism, swine were sacrificed on it. Okay, so this is how hostile to God this Antiochus IV is. This is exactly what Daniel saw. Daniel saw this. And that conduct of Antiochus IV, that conduct sparked a successful Jewish revolt, which began in 166 BC. It is known as the Maccabean Revolt. I'm sure you've run across that. It's named after a prime figure, Judas Maccabeus. So this action of this guy Antiochus triggers a successful Jewish revolt, the Maccabean Revolt. Now Daniel is told to close up the vision because it's not to be fulfilled for a long time. And that's true, right? It's not going to be fulfilled till we're way down in 168. Daniel's getting this vision in 550. So he tells him to seal it up. And I think that speaks symbolically here when it says seal it up. I think what he's talking about is it's a symbolic reference to safeguarding the vision so it would be available for generations in the distant future, rather than sealing it up so as to keep it from anybody. In other words, I think it's a preservation thing because we're going to need to have it, because it won't be fulfilled for quite a long time. Now, the vision of persecution of God's people that he saw in Antiochus IV, not by that name, but by this character who's described there, that vision of persecution and suffering of the people and what's in store was so powerful that Daniel is overwhelmed and he's ill or exhausted. That's the effect that it had on him. For several days he's that way. And then he rises and goes about his duties for the king. And he continued to be appalled by the vision. Just grabbed by it, horrified by it. And he acknowledges that he didn't fully grasp it. Now you can imagine, right? I mean, he's seeing these things. He's going, exactly what is going on here. All right, so that's chapter 8. Now, in chapter 9, Daniel notes that here at the beginning of chapter 9, that in the first year of the reign of Darius the Mede, you remember I argue that that's Cyrus. Cyrus the Persian, Darius the Mede, I contend is one and the same. We went through that. So in the first year of the reign of Darius the Mede, he understood in the scrolls. ESV says in the books. He says in the scrolls, meaning those scrolls that were recognized by the Jewish people as inspired by God. That's what he means. Whether you take it as books or scrolls, he's talking about a distinctive set of books. You don't just say, well, I understood in the books. Well, what books? Well, you know the books I'm talking about. You know the scrolls I'm talking about. I'm talking about the inspired scrolls. Okay? He understood from the inspired scrolls, those inspired by God, that God had revealed to the prophet Jeremiah that it would take 70 years for fulfilling the desolations of Jerusalem. All right, so Daniel here in the first year of Darius, he recognizes from the scrolls, from Scripture, that God had revealed to Jeremiah that it was going to take 70 years for the fulfilling of the desolations of Jerusalem. In other words, the Jewish exile from the city of Jerusalem would last that long. But it wasn't clear, right? It wasn't clear. Here he sees Jeremiah talking about 70 years for the desolations of Jerusalem. He understood that, but it's not clear when does the clock begin to run. There's ambiguity here. There were 3 exiles, Daniel in 605, exiles of Ezekiel in 597. Then you have the big one in 587 when the city's destroyed. So he understands this, but there's ambiguity because when does the clock begin to run? And also, is the 70 years intended to be literally 70 years? Or is it symbolic for the completeness of God's time? 7 and 10, both being in apocalyptic literature, often used for completeness. So if you had 70, 7 times 10, maybe that's it. So he recognizes this idea of 70 years, but there's some ambiguity in when it's actually going to be fulfilled. Now, the first year of Darius's reign that he's referring to, that probably refers to his first full regnal year as the ruler of the defeated Babylonians. And that first full year as ruler of the defeated Babylonians begins in March of 538 BC. And this was not long after Daniel's deliverance from the lion's den in chapter 6. So Daniel has now been in, at that time, Daniel's been in Babylonian captivity for 67 or 68 years. He's probably 80 plus years old now. So that's just kind of to set that for you. And the passages in Jeremiah to which Daniel is referring are Jeremiah chapter 25, verses 11 and 12, and Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 10. Now, both of those texts indicate that at the end of the 70 years, there's some ambiguity. When is it coming? But both of those texts indicate that the end of the 70 years would be marked by God's punishment of Babylonia. All right, so that's a datum, right? It's going to be marked by God's punishment of Babylonia. And in light of Babylonia's recent fall to the Medes and the Persians, well, Daniel now is perceiving whatever the ambiguity, because the Babylonians have now fallen, Daniel is perceiving that the time for restoration, the time for the completion of the 70 years referred to in Jeremiah, well, it was at hand. Okay, so he's living here, looking around. Okay, it's got to be soon. You see, we're getting to it. And that's what motivates Daniel's prayer. That's what takes his prayer that takes up the majority of chapter 9. It is his realization, based on the 70 years mentioned by Jeremiah, that, he's smelling it, because the Babylonians have fallen to the Medes and Persians, and they were going to be destroyed or punished in association with the fulfillment of the 70 years. So now he's really excited, and that motivates the prayer. And in verses 3 through 19 of Daniel chapter 9, he recounts how he, with fasting and in sackcloth and ashes, he recounts there that how he, with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes, of course, those are emblems of repentance. Right? So he's fasting, he's in sackcloth and ashes. He recounts how he poured out his heart to God on behalf of Israel. It is a powerful, penitent plea for God now to fulfill his promise to end the punishment by restoring his people to Jerusalem. He's been in captivity a long time. He sees what Jeremiah says. He sees what he reads as, okay, we're about there. And so you have this passionate, penitent plea for God to go ahead and complete his promise to restore them, to end the desolation of Jerusalem. And he's praying for that. And Daniel seems to have in mind Solomon's prayer at the dedication of the newly built temple in Jerusalem. That prayer that I read a week or two ago in 1 Kings chapter 8, specifically the section in 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 46 to 51. Solomon prayed over 400 years earlier. Solomon prayed, he said, if they sin, this is at the dedication of the temple in Jerusalem that Solomon has had constructed. He says, if they sin against you, for there's no one who does not sin, and you are angry with them and give them to an enemy, so that they're carried away captive to the land of the enemy, far off or near, yet if they turn their heart in the land to which they've been carried captive and repent and plead with you in the land of their captors, saying, we have sinned and have acted perversely and wickedly. If they repent with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of their enemies who carried them captive, and pray to you toward their land which you gave to their fathers, the city that you have chosen, and the house that I built for your name, then hear in heaven your dwelling place their prayer and their plea, and maintain their cause. And forgive your people who've sinned against you and all their transgression that they've committed against you. And grant them compassion in the sight of those who carried them captive, that they may have compassion on them. For they are your people and your heritage, which you brought out of Egypt from the midst of the iron furnace. So Daniel follows the condition expressed in Solomon's request, even tracking in Daniel chapter 9, verse 5, some of Solomon's language, where he says, we have sinned and done wrong and we've acted wickedly. It's like he's tracking just what Solomon had prayed when they're captive. And they pray to you this way, hear them, honor their cause. So Daniel is here using Solomon's language, saying, okay, bring the time to an end. End the desolations. Return your people to Jerusalem. Do that, please. And as they're truly penitent people, you see, Daniel says, look, God need not delay the promised extension of mercy to his people in captivity. That's what Daniel's doing. That's what he's doing there. And just as is done in the book of Lamentations, okay, which is written after the fall of Jerusalem in 587 when it's all destroyed. It's a very gripping. You want to see the consequences of sin laid out and the punishment laid out. God's all good. Look, you continue to defy God, and when the hammer falls, it falls. And you see it there, how gut-wrenching it is. But just as there in the book of Lamentations, Daniel connects their present suffering in Babylonian captivity to God's righteous judgment against them for their persistent rebellion. Daniel understands why they're there. He understands that. So Daniel prays in verses 11 and 12. He says, all Israel has transgressed your law and turned aside, refusing to obey your voice. And the curse and oath that are written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, have been poured out upon us because we have sinned against him. This is on us. Okay? God begged, sent prophets, pleaded, did things to them, disciplined them, withheld this, withheld that. I don't care about you. I'm going to do my thing. What have you done for me lately? Okay. He understands that. He says he has confirmed his words which he spoke against us and against our rulers who ruled us by bringing upon us a great calamity. For under the whole heaven there has not been done anything like what has been done against Jerusalem. Jerusalem got the hammer. Okay, it got the hammer, as I say. When you look in Lamentations, you see the extent of that hammer. He got the hammer for sure. Now verses 16 to 19. They're an appeal to God's mercy that he not delay in delivering them from captivity. That he again look with favor on Jerusalem and on his destroyed sanctuary. Don't delay. Act now. Now, it wasn't long after this, not long after this at all, Cyrus would issue his decree permitting the Jews to return to Jerusalem. That's the decree that you see in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. So this is what's happened. Daniel sees, he sees the times. He can read the seasons. This excites him to pray this passionate prayer. And not long after that, the answer is, it's time. Okay? And then Cyrus says, you can return. And it's just amazing. Now in Daniel chapter 9, verses 20 to 23, he reports that the angel Gabriel appearing as a man. He comes to Daniel while Daniel was praying in a state of extreme weariness or exhaustion, probably associated with his fasting. Now, the reason I put modified here is because you see it in the little brackets here. He came to me in my state of extreme weariness. That's from the New English translation. There are a number of other translations and scholars that think that is the best phrasing, rather than the more common rendering, he came in swift flight. Okay, I think this is better. This is right. But is it debatable? Of course it is. If it wasn't debatable, it wouldn't be in the translations, because your translations are done by Hebrew scholars. Okay, so yes, it's debatable, but I think this is more in line with what's going on. So he comes in, he has this, that he's exhausted. He's absolutely exhausted. And the angel Gabriel comes to him at that point, and Gabriel informs Daniel that because Daniel is greatly loved, that he, Gabriel, has come to him to give him wisdom or insight and understanding by delivering to him a message that went out when Daniel began praying. Because you're loved, Daniel, I'm here to bring you up to speed. I'm here to give you wisdom and give you insight by delivering this message to you, a message that went out when you began praying. Now, the message that Gabriel delivers to Daniel, this insight and wisdom that he's giving to him. Now, this is widely recognized, verses 24 to 27, as one of the most difficult texts in the book of Daniel and perhaps in the Old Testament. Okay? So you're going to have mercy on me as I give you my breakdown of this. Okay? But these things, these kind only come out with prayer and fasting. I mean, these things are difficult. But I'm going to give you what I think is going on. I'll offer my understanding, okay, but well aware that there are other ways of skinning this cat. The way I'm giving to you, I think, is the best, or I wouldn't be giving it to you. Okay? But I have no delusions of grandeur. I understand that I'm just a guy hacking away and trying to understand something. Okay? But I want to deliver it to you. This translation that I'm going to use here, because again, it will make it easier for me to explain to you how I understand. The translation that I'm going to use of verses 24 to 27 is a composite translation of various standard translations, nothing tricky, okay? Standard translations and commentary by Hebrew scholars. Okay, I've got a lot of commentaries by people who are really well known. And so this is a composite translation. And that'll just allow me to skip some stuff. Now, because of God's great love, in Daniel 24 to 27, because of God's great love for Daniel, okay, which God was prompted to express by Daniel's tremendous prayer of contrition. So God expresses his love. Because of his love, great love for Daniel, God is giving Daniel a vision of the future of the Jewish nation. He's going to give Daniel this vision of the future of the Jewish nation. God's people as centered around the holy city of Jerusalem. So that's what he's offering to him here. And this vision goes beyond the return from exile that's referred to by Jeremiah. He's going to give Daniel, because of his love for Daniel, he's going to reveal to Daniel something that goes beyond. He's going to reveal to him his future dealings and workings with the nation of Israel. Okay? Focused on Jerusalem. Jim McGuiggan, in his commentary, he says, God is saying to Daniel, yes, I know 70 years were decreed and are now fulfilled. But Daniel, I have another decree. It is one which carries within it the outline of my completed work in regard to your nation. I'm going to give you the big picture. Okay? I'm going to give you the big picture here, Daniel. And the message to Daniel indicates, consistent with the visions of chapter 2, remember the statue, Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Chapter 7, the beast coming out of the tumultuous sea. Consistent with the visions of chapter 2 and 7, that God's kingdom in the person of the Messiah, the great Davidic king, which kingdom is the full and true fulfillment for which they long, that kingdom would not come at the time of their physical return from exile, but only after a much longer time than the time they had spent in exile. Okay, so he's letting them know that just like you saw in chapter 2 and 7, that this kingdom comes in the Roman Empire. So he's letting him know that this God's Messiah, that this kingdom that is this ultimate fulfillment, will not come at the return from exile at the fulfillment of the 70 years of the prophecy of Jeremiah. Okay? That's going to be something. But that's not going to be the kingdom that you've been looking for. It's going to come only after a much longer time than the 70 years that you spent in exile. It's going to come after 77s instead of 70 years. Okay, so that kingdom's it's not going to come right when you come back from exile, you see. and Israel's return from exile, you can see how it would naturally be thought over or could be anticipated as being tied tightly to the return or to the coming of the Messiah. Right? One like Moses, who led the Exodus out of Egypt. Well, now we're going to be another Exodus out of Babylonian captivity, and you can see how anticipation of, okay, well, this is now the time of the Messiah, the one like Moses. And he's letting him know, no, that's not it. That's not going to happen until after a time much longer than the time that you spent in captivity. You see, the Messiah, the ultimate answer to their and the nation's needs, was still, after their return, he was still the rise of two kingdoms away. They're allowed to come back when the Persians defeat the Babylonians, but you still have the Grecian Empire and then the Roman Empire. And it is in the Roman Empire that the Messiah and his kingdom will come. Now, through Messiah's coming, God will finally, effectively, and ultimately deal with transgression and sin and atone for iniquity. He will bring in everlasting righteousness. He will seal both vision and prophecy in the sense of certifying their authenticity by fulfilling their messages, and he will anoint the Most Holy One. Okay, so this is what's in store. This is what he's pointing to. This is what is going to take place. And in verse 25, Gabriel says that the 69 sevens that precede the coming of the Messiah, the ruler, identified as the ruler, or you could translate the prince or the leader, the Messiah, the anointed one, the ruler, that the 69 sevens that precede the coming of the Messiah in the climactic 70th seven. Okay, so he's coming, the anointed one is coming in the climactic 70th seven, and the 69 sevens that will precede his coming in the climactic 70th seven, that those 69 sevens are divided into two groups. Two groups or two periods. There is first a period of 7 sevens, and then a period of 62 sevens. 69 total before the climactic 70th seven, divided into 7 sevens and 62 sevens. Okay? That's what I think is the correct translation. Now, I recognize there are a number of English translations. They translate the verse in keeping with the uninspired accents of the Masoretic text. Accents that were developed by the Masoretes 500 AD and after. And they translate it that way. Let me say this and then I'll shut up. I heard that bell. And when they do it, they then put a stop after 7 sevens, instead of like the ESV and most English translations, recognize that he will come after the combination of 7 sevens and 62 sevens. But there are English translations that follow the accent marks of the Masoretic text, and they put a stop there and they say, he will come after 7 sevens, period. And then the 62 sevens are supposedly after he comes. I think that's a mistake. Okay, so most translations, I think, get it right, that he's talking about 69 sevens in 7 sevens and 62 sevens that precede his coming in the climactic 70th seven. So much to talk about. I hate bells, but that's life. You got nerve.